He signed the paper without looking at me, just picked up the pen, scrawled his name, and slid it back across the kitchen table like it was a receipt for something he'd already thrown away. My son-in-law didn't even look up. I stood there in my own kitchen, in the house I had lived in for 31 years, and I remember thinking, this is the moment. This is when it changes. I was right. I just didn't know yet which direction it would change in. My name is Elaine. I am 67 years old. I taught 4th grade for 26 years at Riverside Elementary in Macon, Georgia. I retired early, not because I wanted to, but because my hip gave out the winter before last, and standing on linoleum floors from 7 in the morning until 3 in the afternoon stopped being something I could do without crying on the drive home. I never remarried after my husband Gerald passed. That was 9 years ago. Pancreatic cancer, 6 weeks from diagnosis to the end. We didn't even have time to say everything we needed to say. But I had my daughter Joanna. I need you to understand something before I go any further. I loved that girl with everything I had. I drove her to dance class 3 times a week for 8 years. I sat through every recital, every school play, every breakup, every bad decision. When she got pregnant at 24 with a man she barely knew, I didn't say a word against her. When she married him 8 months later in a ceremony at the courthouse with a dozen people and a grocery store cake, I stood next to her and I smiled. His name was Bryce. I never trusted Bryce. Not because he was unkind in obvious ways. He wasn't loud. He didn't drink. He held the door open and said, "Yes, Mum," the first time he met me, and I thought, well, at least there's that. But there was something underneath it. A kind of stillness that wasn't peace, more like patience, like he was waiting for something. I found out eventually what he was waiting for. After Gerald died, the house was paid off. We'd put every extra dollar into it for 20 years. Gerald was proud of that. He grew up in a house where his family got evicted twice before he was 10, and owning a home outright meant something different to him than it does to most people. When he died, he left me that house and about $40,000 in savings, which sounds like a lot until you do the math on living alone on a teacher's pension for potentially another 20 or 30 years. I was careful with it. I didn't touch the savings unless I had to. I kept my expenses small. I grew tomatoes in the backyard. I clipped coupons the way my mother taught me. I drove a 2009 Camry that still ran fine even though my daughter seemed embarrassed by it. Joanna and Bryce lived about 40 minutes away, in a house they'd bought during the pandemic when prices were still low. That part, at least, they'd done right. But then Bryce lost his job. He was in sales, medical equipment, the kind of thing where the income depends entirely on commissions, and when his company was bought out by a larger one, his whole division was restructured. He was out in February. He spent 3 months applying for things, then stopped, then picked up some consulting work that I never fully understood and that didn't seem to pay much. Joanna was working as a dental hygienist. Good work, steady, but not enough for 2 people and a mortgage, especially once they started adding things to that mortgage. A finished basement, a new roof they said they needed, a trip to Cancun that I knew about because I saw the photos on Facebook. They came to me in April. Joanna sat across from me at this same kitchen table and explained that they needed help. Temporary help, just until Bryce found something steady. She had her hands folded in front of her and she spoke carefully, like she'd rehearsed it. And I remember noticing that Bryce wasn't there. He was waiting in the car. I said yes. Of course I said yes. She was my daughter. I gave them $9,000 that month. Then $6,000 in June. Then $4,000 in August. This time for something about the water heater, and also Bryce's car registration, and also something about a medical bill for my grandson, little Caleb, who was 5 by then, and the only truly uncomplicated person in that house. By October, I had given them just over $22,000. I didn't keep a formal record. That was my mistake. I trusted that she knew what it meant. I trusted that she understood that money was most of what I had. In November, something shifted. Joanna started calling less. When she did call, she was distracted, short. She came by once with Caleb and didn't stay long. Bryce sent me a text thanking me for dinner at Thanksgiving, a dinner I had cooked alone and driven 40 minutes to their house to serve, and the text said, "Thanks for coming, Elaine." Not Mom. Not even a name with any warmth in it. Just my first name, like I was a neighbour who dropped off a casserole. I noticed. I didn't say anything because I didn't want to make things difficult. I was still hoping it was stress. I was still telling myself it would smooth out. Then in January, Joanna called and told me she'd found a financial advisor. She said it so casually, like she was telling me about a new podcast she discovered. She said that Bryce and she had been talking, and they were worried about me. About my situation. They felt I wasn't being strategic with my money. They wanted me to sit down with this advisor, a friend of Bryce's, she said, just to get a second opinion on things. I said, "What things exactly?" She said, "Well, the house for one." The house was a significant asset that was just sitting there. The property values in my neighbourhood had gone up. A lot. And I was one person living in a 4-bedroom house on a street where young families were buying up everything. I said, "I know. Gerald and I raised our family in this house." She said, "I know that, Mum." I said, "I'm not selling the house." She said, "No one's saying you have to sell it. It's just there are options. You could sell and move somewhere smaller, somewhere that made more financial sense, and you'd free up a lot of equity that could support you better in the long run. Somewhere smaller, somewhere more manageable." I was 65 years old at the time and perfectly capable of managing my own home. But I didn't say that. I said I'd think about it. I didn't think about it. The advisor meeting happened anyway. Joanna called on a Wednesday and said she'd set something up for Friday, just a conversation, nothing formal. Bryce's friend had a firm downtown. I drove there myself because I wanted to be able to leave. His name was something like Garrett. He was maybe 32. He had a very clean desk and he spoke to me like I was slightly confused about what decade it was. He talked about portfolio reallocation and liquidating underperforming assets. And at some point he said the words estate planning in a way that made it clear he thought I should be more focused on what happened after I was gone than on what I was going to do with the next 20 years. He had a folder with my address on it. I don't know how he had my address in a printed folder before we'd ever met. I didn't ask. I just noted it. I drove home and I sat in Gerald's chair in the living room and I looked at the walls, the photos, the corner where Joanna used to leave her dance bag every Thursday, the windowsill where Gerald kept his coffee cup while he read on Sunday mornings. I thought, something is happening here and I have been too slow to see it. In February, Joanna asked me to add her to my bank account. She said it was just practical, in case something happened to me. She didn't want there to be complications. She'd read something about how difficult it could be for families when accounts weren't set up properly. I said I'd look into it. She asked again in March. I said I was still looking into it. In April, she came by with Bryce and they sat at this table, and they made a different kind of argument. Not soft this time. Bryce did most of the talking. He said that they had gone out on a limb for me by consulting that advisor, by trying to help me plan properly, and I was being resistant, and it wasn't fair to them or to Caleb. He said that as my family, as the people who would be responsible for me as I got older, they deserved to have some visibility into my finances. Visibility. That was the word he used. Joanna sat next to him and she didn't correct him. I looked at my daughter and I thought, when did this happen? When did she start sitting on that side of the table? I told them I needed time to think. After they left, I sat in the kitchen for a long time. It was a Tuesday evening in April, and the light through the window was that particular gold that happens in Georgia in the spring, and I remember the exact way it fell across the table, and I thought about Gerald, and I thought about what he would do. Gerald would not have waited. The next morning I called my attorney. I'd had the same attorney for 15 years. His name is not important. What matters is that he'd helped Gerald and me with our wills, and he was the kind of person who didn't speak slowly at you just because your hair had gone grey. I told him what was happening. Not all of it. I didn't have all the words for it yet, but enough. I told him about the money I'd given Joanna and Bryce. I told him about the house conversations. I told him about the account request. He listened. Then he said, "Do you want to protect yourself?" I said yes. He said, "Then let's be methodical." Over the next few weeks we did several things. We updated my will. We established a revocable living trust with a specific distribution structure. We documented the loans I'd made to Joanna and Bryce because he agreed with me they were loans, even if I'd never said that word out loud. And we drafted a letter I did not send yet, but kept. I also opened a new savings account at a different bank. Small, separate. I transferred a portion of my money into it quietly. I didn't hide it. Everything was above board. My attorney knew. It was in my name. But I didn't mention it to anyone. The house I put in the trust. That was the part that mattered most. A home in a revocable living trust still belongs to you. You can live in it, sell it, do with it what you choose, as long as you're living, but it doesn't pass through probate. The distribution goes exactly as you specify. I specified very carefully. I also specified that the loans, $22,000, documented now with dates and amounts, would be deducted from Joanna's share of the estate before she received anything, not as punishment, as accounting. I signed the documents on a Thursday afternoon. I drove home. I made dinner. I watched the news. I didn't feel powerful. I didn't feel like I'd won anything. I felt steady, like I had just finished securing something in a storm, and now I could wait and see what the storm did. It arrived in June. Joanna called on a Monday morning and said she needed to talk to me in person. She came alone, which surprised me. She sat at the table, this table, and she had the look she used to get as a teenager when she'd done something she hadn't fully thought through. She said Bryce had found a property, a house they could buy at a good price, but they needed a down payment and they needed it quickly. She said she knew it was a lot to ask. She said $150,000. I looked at her. She said it would come out of the house anyway eventually. This way, it could help them now when they actually needed it. She said they were struggling. She said she didn't know what else to do. I said, "Joanna, I put the house in a trust." She went very still. I said, "I did it in May. My attorney helped me. The house isn't something I can pull equity from the way you're thinking. It's structured differently now." She stared at me. I saw something move across her face. I have known her face my entire life. I watched it take its first breath, and I know every expression it makes. And what moved across it was not sadness. It was calculation. She was recalculating. Then she said something I have never forgotten. She leaned back and she looked at me the way you look at something that has finally confirmed a long-held suspicion, and she said, "You're going to die alone in that house, and there's not going to be anything left anyway. You're spending it down faster than you think." She said it calmly. That's what I remember most. Not with cruelty in her voice, but with a flatness that was worse than cruelty. Like she'd already decided I was a closed chapter, and this was just acknowledgement. I didn't respond. I looked at my hands on the table. She left 10 minutes later. I didn't sleep well that night. I won't pretend otherwise. I lay in the dark in the house Gerald and I had built our life in, and I thought about all the ways I'd tried to do right by her. Every sacrifice I'd named to myself over the years and never named out loud to her, because that wasn't how I was raised, and that wasn't how I raised her. I thought about Caleb, my grandson, who had done nothing wrong. who still called me Grammy and asked me to read to him, and fell asleep on my couch with his shoes still on. Whatever happened between his parents and me, I didn't want him to pay for it. That's what hurt most. Not the money, not even what she said, but the knowledge that the person sitting across from me at that table had made a choice somewhere along the way. Maybe slowly, maybe not all at once, to see me as a resource rather than a person. I called my attorney the next morning. I told him what she'd said. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Do you want to make any changes to the documents?" I thought about it. "A long time." I said, "Yes, one change." I told him about Caleb, about the trust distribution. I wanted to add a provision, a direct allocation to Caleb, held in a separate sub-trust until he turned 25, that bypassed his parents entirely, his education, a start in life, something that was his and only his. My attorney said he could do that. I said, "Do it." The months that followed were quiet in a way I hadn't expected. Joanna and I didn't speak for a while. Then she called around Thanksgiving, like nothing had happened. Asked if I wanted to come for dinner. I said yes. I went. I sat at her table and I watched Caleb eat mashed potatoes and talk about a book he was reading in school. Bryce was there. We were all very polite. She never asked about the trust again. I think she assumed I'd changed my mind, or that I might, that if she was pleasant enough and patient enough, I would undo the damage. I didn't undo anything. I just kept living. That spring, I finally got my hip looked at properly. Turns out the first surgeon had been too conservative, and there was a procedure I could have had sooner. And I had it done in February, and by April I was walking in the neighborhood again, 40 minutes most evenings. Past the houses where I'd known the families for 25 years. I started tutoring again. Just 2 afternoons a week, kids who needed extra help with reading. I didn't charge much. It kept me useful, and it kept me out of my own head. I started talking to a woman from my church, another widow about my age, who'd been through something similar with her son. We met for coffee on Thursdays and talked about everything except our children, mostly. That was its own kind of medicine. What I want to say, and I know some of you watching have been through something that felt like this, or you love someone who has, is that I did not know I was capable of the thing I did. I don't mean the attorney. I don't mean the trust. I mean the part before that, where I had to look at a situation clearly and accept that the person I loved most in the world was doing something harmful to me. And that loving her did not mean I had to let it continue. That was hard. It took longer than I'm proud of. The letter I mentioned, the one my attorney drafted, the one I never sent, I did eventually send a version of it, not to Joanna, to myself. I sat at this table on a Sunday afternoon in October, and I wrote down everything I'd given and everything I'd felt and everything I'd decided, and then I folded it up and put it in a box on the top shelf of the closet where Gerald used to keep his important papers. It's there right now. I don't need to read it. I just needed to write it. Joanna and I have a relationship now. It's different than it was. Smaller, maybe. More careful. Some mornings, I grieved the version of it I wanted, the easy warmth I thought we'd have when she was grown and settled, and I was old enough to need her sometimes. But I am not a woman who disappears to keep the peace, Gerald used to say. And I can still hear him exactly, his voice in this kitchen, his coffee cup on that windowsill. He used to say that dignity wasn't something anybody could take from you. They could make it harder to hold on to, but the holding on was always yours. I held on. Caleb came over last Saturday. He's 6 now. He sat at this table and we did a puzzle together, a big one with horses on it, and he told me about a dream he'd had about a train that could talk, and he laughed so hard at his own telling of it that he nearly knocked his juice over. That is what I have. That is what no one can touch. And if you are sitting somewhere tonight feeling like the people who were supposed to protect you have turned the wrong direction, I want you to hear this. You are not too old to make a decision. You are not too late. And you do not have to hand over the keys to your own life just because someone is standing at your door with their hand out. Take the time you need, then call someone you trust, then be methodical. The rest follows. I still think about that April evening when Bryce used the word visibility. The way he said it, so measured, so reasonable, like he was asking for something small, like transparency between family members, was the most natural thing in the world. And maybe it would have been if the previous 12 months hadn't shown me exactly what they intended to do with whatever I handed over. That's the thing about what happened to me. It didn't arrive all at once. It came in increments. A conversation here, a request there, each one just slightly further than the last, and each one made easier by the fact that I had already said yes before. That's how I lost $22,000 without ever feeling like I was making a catastrophic decision. I was making a series of small ones, each of them reasonable on its own, none of them reasonable in the picture they were building together. I think about right and wrong a lot now, not in a grand way, but in the daily way, the way you make choices when no one is watching. Joanna knew what she was doing wasn't right. I saw it in her face at that table, in the way she wouldn't quite meet my eyes when Bryce was making his argument for civility. She knew, and she sat there anyway. That gap between knowing something is wrong and doing it anyway, that's where I lost her, I think. Not when they spent the money. Before that, when she chose to let it happen and stay quiet. I don't say this to condemn her. I say it because I spent a long time trying to figure out what I could have done differently, and the honest answer is I should have thought more carefully sooner. I trusted in a way that wasn't grounded in evidence. I confused love with good judgment. Those are two separate things, and mixing them up cost me. What saved me was slowing down, sitting in Gerald's chair and deciding to look at the situation as it actually was, not as I wanted it to be. That took more out of me than I expected. It's hard to see clearly when the thing you're looking at is someone you raised, but once I saw it, I didn't look away. I called my attorney. I was methodical. I asked the right questions and I followed through on the answers, even when part of me wanted to find a reason not to. There's a kind of strength that doesn't look like strength from the outside. It doesn't raise its voice. It doesn't issue ultimatums or make scenes. It just quietly closes the door that someone else left open and says, "Not this. Not anymore. I used to think that strength meant enduring. Now I think it means knowing the difference between endurance and surrender. Caleb is going to be okay. That's what I hold on to. Whatever his parents do or don't do with their lives, that boy has something set aside that is his, and only his. Something his grandmother built for him carefully, on purpose, with full awareness of what she was doing. That feels like the right use of what I have left. I don't need to be thanked for it. I just needed to do it, and I needed to stop disappearing to keep the peace.